Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome to another great episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Cherokee Booth. In this episode, we'll be analyzing some project documents. There are a lot of documents to sift through throughout the duration of your project. So to help us with that, we have Mr. Ronnie Wong. Thank you for being with us today, Ronnie.
Well, thank you for having me back on the show as we continue on with more CompTIA Project Plus. When we talk about the idea of analyzing our project documentation, what we want to make sure that we understand is what are the necessary elements that normally you find inside of that project documentation, and what is our takeaway if we're really just getting started. What do we need to understand, and why is this particular document going to be very important for us as we start to manage projects? So we're going to take a look at, well, a lot of, I think Cherokee, you counted, what is it, 11 or 12?
Yeah.
11. So we're going to talk about 11 of them very briefly. We're going to show some of them. We're not going to show all of them because, well, sometimes just showing all of them, they just look like forms after a while. So we're just going to show a few of them so that we understand what we have. So when a project begins, overall, the clear understanding is from the initiation phase, the only way we get started into the project itself essentially is for us to have what we call a project charter. Okay? Now, normally when we start taking a look at the project charter, there's a lot of information that we can include in there. Okay? So here's an example of one that we've created a while ago here at IT Pro TV, where you do tend to have the title, the sponsor name, and the project manager, as well as when this was prepared. You might see like all this information as well. The purpose or justification, why in the world is this project needed?
So this part needs to be pretty specific, right? We should include things like our projected ROI, our you know, what exactly we're doing here, the definition.
Yeah, you're actually trying to make sure that everybody understands that. And so even though we actually put a small box in here, this could take pages if you wanted it to fill out every single little detail. And depending on your need, you may actually choose to have something like that. If your project's fairly simple, it might actually be able to be put into these little boxes as well. You need to have an understanding, of course, of the high-level risk and of the overall objectives that you have to be able to understand as well. You might even have milestones. Now, not everything here is actually going to necessarily be in every single project charter. But when it comes down to it, when you start seeing all these different categories, manager-level authority, this depends on if your organization is balanced matrix, or is it projectized, or is this a functional type of organization? Staffing decisions, who's actually going to be making those. But really, when it comes down to it, the most important element is right here at the end. Okay? Getting the whole thing started and understand why this particular project exists, and understanding what the risks are, all the stuff that we saw, don't get me wrong, is important. But the most important element is right here. Okay? If you do not get a signature, despite all of your work in the initiation phase of generating everything else, this does not count as a project charter. That's the scariest thing in the world, is that at the very end of all of your hard work during that time, when nothing else is going on and you've planned out at least and taken a look at everything in your project, without this,
You must get that approval.
you must have the approval or it's not a project. So very strange to actually have to do as much work to get to getting a project done than to actually have a project done sometimes. But it can actually stop right here where you fail to actually end up getting the sponsor who actually has that authority and that approval that then begins the process at that point that you can start to now move into planning the project itself. So that is by far the key element that we also want to make sure that we understand here. Okay? Now, when we have this, okay, that means we can actually move into our project plan at that particular point. And even though in our original charter, let me see if I actually have it in here. Yeah, we have that purpose and that justification, but the strange thing is, as much as this is a high-level overview of what the project is and who's responsible for it, okay, notice that it really doesn't tell us what the project does. It justifies the project existing. It justifies the very fact that we need it. It tells us what the risks are, but the very fact is it really doesn't tell us what is this project actually meant to do and what is it not designed to do in itself. And so that is when we actually have to move on to another part that begins in the planning stage. Okay? Now, I don't have an example of an entire project plan because that can actually take hundreds of pages, maybe even thousands of pages, depending on the way that everything is set up. But a lot of times it actually comes into a bound book, for your project, or a 3-ring binder, or whatever it might be, where the entire project plan rests within that particular container of sorts, right? That codex that you end up having. But in that sense, that's pretty good. But one of the first elements that you also end up making there, though, is what we call a project scope statement. All right. So in a project scope statement, this is where you start describing what the project is going to deliver and the work that's required to create those deliverables, okay? So that is really kind of the key when you start to do this. Now you might be wondering, like, where the heck do these forms come from if you're doing this, right? So as a project manager, a lot of times when you start off, especially in large office, as a project management office, you might find out they already have templates for you to fill in. And this is an example of a template, okay? If you're not exactly sure what needs to go in here, it normally gives you the purpose beyond this, allows you to actually be able to do everything else here too, okay? So notice that it actually enables the project team, let me see if I can zoom in here, okay? It enables the project team to perform a more detailed planning, guides the project team's work during the execution, provides a baseline for evaluating whether requests or changes or any additional work contained within or outside of the project's boundaries, okay? So it really does provide all of that for us. And so when we start, we want to make sure that this is one of the very first things that we work on, is to identify the scope, the limitation of our project. If not, this is when a project does essentially become like weddings. Starts off very small in mind, but it continues to grow and grow and grow. The project scope is the single document that actually says, here's the limitations of this project. It's not designed to do everything. It essentially, says, here's areas we're not going to do. Here's what we're actually focused in on doing. And so that's what you'll actually also end up seeing here too. So notice they describe it in terms of requirements, boundaries, the deliverables. Is there an acceptance criteria, milestones? And so even though these are kind of filled in on a single page, right? This can, of course, take pages and pages and pages too. But when it comes down to it, okay, the whole goal is to understand what is really going to be about the project boundaries and the requirements that we need to have. Those are kind of the most important elements. The other ones really do help you in planning out the rest. So you might go ahead and, let's say, you define the actual project requirements here with the definition understanding, and then you define the boundaries, and then at that point you have to go through, and now this is where they talk about the basic planning, right? Well, what's next? You define the project boundary. You also take a look at whatever the acceptance criteria is, and you start planning those things out. Without the scope statement, very difficult to plan out a project if you don't know what its actual requirements are, if you don't know what the limitations are. So this is kind of the first element in the entire project plan that could now expand, like I said, hundreds, if not even thousands of pages, depending on how big the project is. It could just be 50 pages. It could be 10 pages. Heck, on a small project, it could just be a page like this if you chose to. But documentation is important, especially in a larger organization. Once you have these things and you continue on, you'll start seeing that all the other smaller plans that you have inside of your project plan, they'll need to be approved. And then finally, the overall project plan itself will need to be approved as well. And that's when you get ready for the execution phase of your project. Okay?
Yeah, and Ronnie, you mentioned that you could go ahead and if your organization already had some, you might be able to use a previous one as an example, a template. But if your company doesn't, then you can always hop online. In the US, even I6 Sigma has a ton of different templates online. In the UK, there's Prince2. Just look at their online resources, and that's what the internet's for, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of them that you can actually use to help you to define that. But whatever company you end up working for, you'll probably also have to follow what they choose to follow,
right,
and that's
that
kind of
trumps
the key.
yeah.
It trumps all the other organizations.
Yeah.
All these other ones are really...
It can give you a good idea.
Yeah. Well, it's a standard, right? It's an industry type of standard that we really do need to think about. But when it comes down to what your organization wants, it does tend to trump the standard idea of that's the bare minimum. That's the way that a lot of organizations would say that. Here's what we have to meet, but then they may actually require more, okay? So along with that in the project plan, that big, gigantic notebook of things that you have, that was the word I was looking for. I kept calling it a codex. Notebook that you were looking for. You might also, of course, have an organizational chart to show that you have a graphic understanding of the actual hierarchy in terms of authority in your project. So in this sense, when you start to take a look at that, organizational charts can be included. Usually it's a great idea to have one, especially if you have a lot of people that don't know exactly what the lines of authority are. Usually this really does help inside of the project plan, so everybody has a page to flip through.
And even at minimum on your project charter, at least the ones that I've done, you would at least want to put the higher ups on there, like your sponsors, your champions, project manager on the project charter itself.
Right, yeah, it's really important because it does. Anybody that gets a copy of that project plan, if they're unsure of the nature or of the lines of authority, this will help them to get that straight. So the neat thing is most of the time you don't really have to worry about a lot of this unless you're the only one that's generating all the documentation. You might find out that your project management office, once you get everything approved and started, they'll go ahead and print up essentially your project plan and where it actually, or not the project, the organizational chart, where your name actually does list itself as being the project manager on some project. And that way you actually know exactly what's going on for you there too.
And
okay?
John in the chat mentioned SOX, but that's a good thing to remember as well if you have any kind of regulatory compliances like the Sarbanes-Oxley. So you just have to check with them, see what information should be included.
Right, yeah. Remember, of course, any type of regulatory compliance issues that you have to go through.
It's going to be trumping as well.
It is going to trump no matter what. And normally you tend to deal with that more in the realm of when you have publicly traded companies, especially with the Sarbanes-Oxley thing. If you're dealing with healthcare, of course, then you'll be talking about the idea of the HIPAA compliance stuff. But yeah, all the time, anytime there's compliance issues, all that may actually have to go ahead and be worked in to think about that idea as well inside of the plan. Okay. Remember that we've also taken a look at communications plans as well. Now, this is where it gets a little bit unusual, where people that have not been project managers in the past, where they do get confused about things like everybody knows how to communicate. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about managing the formal communications within the project. Remember that there has to be some type of methodology in which we say, here's the formal way in which the work that needs to be accomplished, where we're going to use a particular system, where we're going to actually have that in place, so that we know exactly what's going on and we can control the information is what you have. So you also have a communications plan also in there, and that usually is going to involve, again, so many different technologies. My recommendation is go back and take a look at where Cherokee and I did talk about some of the different methods of the communications, and your organizations, again, trying to pick what particular methodology and then why they actually might choose to use one over another is also going to help us out too. Okay. Now, once you get kind of the basics of the legwork done in terms of compliance issues, scope management, communications plan, so a lot of it is paperwork. Don't get me wrong, a ton of it is paperwork. This is where you are going to work more closely with your project scheduler and your project coordinator, okay, and also as a project manager, to get things like your work breakdown structure in place, to ensure that you have available resources and to ensure that you can schedule out the actual project in the time that's required for you to take a look at it and to be able to manage the whole thing. So when you start talking about 3 people trying to do this, at least 3, if not entire departments trying to do this, you might find yourself actually scheduling, and you might find an incredible schedule going on to now where it's almost impossible to track. Let me show you what I'm talking about, okay? So here it is. I have a management plan here, and this one is just for some type of commercial construction is what this one is actually for. And you can see that this particular overall plan here, let me zoom out for a moment. My mouse got stuck here, okay? This particular commercial construction plan, its overall duration for the project is really about 344 days. scheduled to go into the last day of February in 2018. So you can imagine that this is pretty hefty here as far as the size of a project. Now, I've never been on a project that's lasted 344 days in duration, okay? But essentially going from, the end of 2016 all the way through the first part of 2018, that's a year and 4 or 5 months, 3 or 4, yeah, somewhere around there. I don't know, I can't count. But that's a long time to actually be working on a single project. All of mine have pretty much been within 2 months or less a lot of times in getting the stuff done, okay? Now, you might go, all right, so why is this actually so impressive? This particular view, if you start looking at this element up here that they call a timeline, okay, this actually does start to work out the entire timeline for us, and you can see that where they are or where we're supposed to be on the 10th right here. So here it is. This is our day right here, this Friday right here is where we're actually seeing, and it's just going to continue to go on and on and on and on. Actually, that's 2017, I'm lying to you. So this is actually about a year from now, I guess, is what it's saying. So, you can see just a basic view. But remember, all that is actually behind scheduling of dates, resources, and availability of everything. Now, if I change our view, though, to the calendar view.
And I like how you're able to go ahead and switch the interface that easily here with Project. And like Ronnie had mentioned before, we do have those training videos for this application in our course library, so check that out also.
Yeah, you want to make sure that you do have at least an understanding here of what's going on those things. So again, do check out the Project show too. Now, you'll notice that this one, right, you can see with these blue bars where essentially the project starts and it doesn't end as we continue to go through the months and months and months, for a year and longer. So you do have where the entire project, you can take a look at a month-by-month basis and what particular projects are being, or tasks are being done, or the work breakdown structure is being done, and how long they're supposed to last, and everything else that you actually end up seeing here. So just zooming in on one of these weeks, right? Let me see if I can scroll this down a little bit. You can see now where all this is supposed to be happening simultaneously. So having some type of way to schedule this is going to be very important. And that is where your commercial project information management systems are really going to be very helpful for you. Your project management information system. See, I even said that backwards. So make sure you take advantage of the tools that are actually available for you so that you can even see the schedule that's going on there too. Okay? So that way you have that ability, of course, to start managing your project as far as the time and the resources go. Now, as your project moves on from having that project plan, okay, you're now going to start the work, right, the execution phase of your project, and that's when we start taking other documentation that's going to need to pop up and going to be addressed. We've also talked about change management, which is going to be very hefty for us. Remember the idea there that you actually formally submit changes, and as well as issues logs that tend to go along with the idea of the formal change management. Whenever there's some type of issue and it requires a change, you need to make sure you log those issues as well to ensure that everybody understands here's the ones that have actually been addressed at some point in time. And so you'll end up seeing that too. Once the work starts on your project and you're into that execution phase and that monitoring phase, right? This is where you're going to need regular reports to come in so that you can do analysis and make decisions on whether or not you need to increase resources. Do you need to decrease resources from one to actually increase resources to another? You need to actually add more money here and take away money from here if you need to. That's when all this comes together. So having a great type of ability to have reports come in through your communication plan so that you can update your actual project plan inside of something like Microsoft Project and the schedule itself is going to be very helpful. Can you do it all on paper? Yes, we've mentioned that before. You absolutely can. But the hard part about doing it all on paper is you don't see where one change affects the entirety of the schedule. Whereas in something like what we're seeing right here on Microsoft Project, one change that can affect the entire schedule, it literally can adjust everything for you so that you know exactly what's going on. So always take a look at that idea of of using a tool that can help you to manage this a little bit better. Okay? The other thing that we've also taken a look at before is just a quick summary of a ton of information, which is the use of a project type of dashboard information too. So let's take a look at one again right here. Okay? So we've used this in a previous episode. If you're going, hey, that looks familiar, it's because it's the same one.
Yeah, we saw it.
We've seen it before. But remember what this does, right? It gives you a lot of summary information in a graphical view very quickly. The way that this one works is based off an Excel spreadsheet, which means as long as I update the data, these charts will also be updated at the same time. I don't have to go in and update the data and then update the chart. So here, though, it actually does it directly in this way. The great thing is if you use most project management information systems, they have the ability to do things that are similar. I'm not going to tell you all of them can do it in this particular detail, because not every one can. But Project actually has a way that they can at least give you the basic information and maybe even create a dashboard for you. But normally when you do that inside a project, you're also requiring a project server so that you can actually display the information.
It's nice when it is set up like that, because you have that real-time information that anyone can access, then those tickers and measuring your different performance metrics in real time there.
Yeah, it's something in which you have to be on top of. As a project manager, remember that your time is no longer yours, right? Every day that you wake up is not like you're actually ever off the clock, and that's why project managers really do make kind of the big bucks, is because they're always on the clock, because they're always managing the project at some point. And even though you can turn over some issues of it, the end responsibility becomes yours, right? So you have to get as much information as possible, be able to analyze the information very quickly. The dashboard here helps us to do that, okay? Now, along with this, the stuff that I really don't like, and I hate to say this, but it's true, I do not like meetings, okay? Anytime you call a meeting to me, it's not that they're not helpful at times. They should absolutely clarify, what needs to be done, and then you walk away from there and there's an action to be done with it. That's hopefully the goal.
Yeah, I'm okay with them as long as they remain productive. If it's just rambling and wasting time, then yeah, I start to get anxious.
So let's talk about a couple of things here when we call meetings, and especially for project management. One, it should never actually be a called meeting if you don't have an agenda, okay? So you want to make sure you establish an agenda and a time period for that meeting instead. That way everybody knows what you're actually talking about before they get there. They have a chance to do that. And they also have a chance maybe to submit items that need to be talked about before. Do not pass out an agenda the very first day anybody gets to see it, the day of the meeting, like as they walk through the door. That doesn't give anybody any hope that the meeting's going to end anytime soon, okay? It's just not going to. So always walk in with an agenda in place, okay? Secondly, make sure minutes are taken in the meeting. Now, talk about minutes, it doesn't have to be a transcription of the entire meeting, okay? You need to understand that the idea of actually having minutes is if a decision is made, okay, that particular decision needs to actually have it worded so that it can be written down and accounted for, so that everybody that was actually in attendance, that should also be in there, but everybody that was in attendance heard it and they all agreed with it or they disagreed with it, okay? If you're actually having one of those meetings, which actually requires a committee decision. Okay.
Yep, and I actually sat on one of those committees before as a secretary, and that was my job. So you need to have it kind of planned out who is responsible for keeping those minutes and submitting them in a timely manner.
Yeah, it's really important, because it's always easy to say, I know that decision was made, and somebody says, I don't think it was made. Yes, you can go back and you can track it even down to the person. If it's a big committee, who actually made the motion and who actually seconded it as well, and what was the actual motion that carried. So there's a lot of times in which this is great. It's great as long as there's also attached to the idea of the agendaed meeting an action plan, okay? It's never great when there's no action plan to the meeting.
POA.
Yep, that's it. Yeah, at this particular point, there always needs it. When you walk away, somebody needs to be responsible for whatever the action is, the implementation of it, and they also need to have a deadline for that action as well. When are you reporting back to me that this is going to be done, or when you're reporting back to the group that this is going to be done? Make sure that happens. If your meetings are short, okay, no big deal, but they should still have an agenda behind them. you should actually have somebody, if it's something important, make sure it's actually written down, clarified, whatever it might be, okay, so that you know that you had the meeting. If you're relying on your memory, that's great if you have a photographic memory, but if you're like me and you have 10 or 15 meetings a day sometimes, good luck at remembering what actually was said at what particular meeting and who was actually there and why did we say it that way. It's amazing. So yeah, even on this show, I may not actually remember what I said 3 minutes ago right now, Cherokee. So I'm glad you're here because you can keep me straight and go, yes, you did say that. No, you didn't.
Oh, the pressure.
Yeah, it's just a lot of pressure because I do tend to talk a lot. But overall, though, you can see where these documents are actually very important for just about everything that we do, okay? Now, the goal here was not to be super exhaustive because we've really taken a ton of episodes to cover what actually happens in those phases, right? So don't worry about it too much, but here we're just kind of making sure that we did a review of the documentation that you'll tend to work with in each stage and what are some of the more important elements in those two. So make sure you review those because you're going to actually come across them again as a project manager.
So I think that about wraps it up for this episode. We've taken a look at nearly a dozen different types of documents. I hope you're all familiar with those by now at this point. So thank you, Ronnie, for being here with us today. And thank you guys for tuning in. Stay tuned. We have more Project Plus headed your way. I'm Cherokee Booth.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
Signing off for IT Pro TV.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.